This is the second episode of Thorin versus Loco. And the topic we've come up with for this one is we were trying to figure out the top 5 Western League of Legends teams. And obviously this is through all of history. But one caveat we did put is in general to just ignore season 1 and like pre-season and stuff, because obviously there was barely any lands back then. And that game is, I put it like this. The difference between season 1 and season 2 is more huge in a massive way than the difference between any other season. Like, even if you look at season 2 and you're like, well, that's kind of like not like League of Legends, they still at least play the basics of like what they do now on the lowest level. So in general, I don't think we would have had anyone from season 1 anyway, but we just said to cut that off. So it's basically like season 2 to season 6 is what we're considering. And the concept of how we're going to do the show is, before we go into our lists, which we haven't shared with each other, by the way, I thought it would be more fun to like kind of find out during the show. We'll first of all outline like what is the kind of like the guiding philosophy behind how you picked your 5. Like, what is your criteria, Loco, that you're judging these teams on which ones do you value more than others, if you can say?
So I value dominance domestically. Like, if a team's going to be good, they at least have to have very good domestic performance.
Sure.
And the second thing I valued was international results and strength relative to the Eastern teams. You can be as good as you want domestically, but if you don't have international results, then you can't be called the greatest Western team of all time.
Okay.
And the third up was length of relevance and recency bias. A team that dominated for course of 2 to 3 years, I'm going to rate higher than a team that dominated for just a year or even a split. And also teams that dominated more recently, I'm going to give a little more score to than a team that dominated way back in season 2. So that would be my criteria for what defines the best Western teams, in my opinion.
Okay. So the 3 key criteria I outlined as like the ones that I'm prioritizing when I looked over the list and what I'd picked is, first of all, I did have like results is the first one, because the problem is, even if I thought a team was amazing and they were really good, like without results, the problem is everyone else that you'd have on a list probably does have results in some way. So usually once you get to like greatest of all time lists, yeah, you have to have won some stuff and you have to have placed pretty highly. So results is like the first criteria.
Flame sucks.
Listen, mate, won a lot of competitions, so results have to be pretty high for this, and this is a team sport, so the difference is, as a team, you should have results. As an individual player, maybe you shouldn't. So the results have to be high, but they have to also be relative to like who you played, for example, which leads into my second point, which is level of play. So I have like 2 components to that. It should be like what the peak is like. So that could be short, but whatever your really, really high peak is like, that has to be good. And then in general, you should overall have a pretty high level of play. It shouldn't just be like one instance that you were super good, if possible. I mean, it's kind of like the longevity one you're talking about. You should have multiple instances of it. And then the last one, it kind of ties into what you said about the Eastern teams. I basically just put it as like competition versus all regions. Like, sure, it's good to win your region, but the problem is, I think this list would get too wacky if you had the people who only dominated their regions and then didn't do well, internationally. So, for example, I mean, we'll see who's in each other's lists, but I have to say outright, I didn't have people like TSM who won the summer split, even though it was incredible dominance domestically, Unfortunately, my other criteria, they obviously didn't live up to. They didn't have any competition that well against the Asians. They didn't really have, like, much time in that sense, just at a split, and they didn't have the results overall internationally. So let's do it this way, then. We've got our criteria, basically, which we can refer back to, obviously. So my plan for how we do this is we don't know each other's 5 at the moment. And presumably, well, I'm pretty certain some of them are going to cross over, but I'm also pretty certain there'll be a couple that probably won't. So what we'll do is, the way we'll reveal it is we'll start at number 5. So we'll start with you. What you'll do is you'll tell me your 5th team, and then your reason, and then I'll kind of like either agree and say where it is on my list, or if I don't have it on my list, I'll explain why I didn't, and we can set up an obvious structure to it, So start off, okay. What's your 5th team?
My 5th team would be C9 from season 3 to season 5.
Sure.
So do you have them on your list?
Yeah. What was your reasoning?
Okay. So they dominated for an incredibly long time, almost 3 years in NA. And they were definite competitors, even up till the point where people were saying stuff like Hai has to go, like Hai's no good anymore. They have to put in Jensen. They need a new mid laner if they want to be able to perform. And so their domestic dominance cannot be argued against. They had one of the best records in NA until TSM broke it. And yeah, they were the original NA team that did it before CLG.
Yep.
And also their international results, even though people don't really credit them for it, they had decent international results. Like they gotten out of groups at Worlds. The very first Worlds they went to was quite unfortunate.
Sure. Yeah.
They had a decent showing at All-Star Paris, and probably doesn't count for a lot, but they won IEM before. IEM San Jose, the one with Unicorns of Love, and
True.
the one where
and TSM.
Alliance. Yeah.
TSM was
So-
there. Just saying.
Okay. So yeah, that's my number 5, C9.
Okay. So here's
Why
the
I
funny
didn't-
thing. Okay.
Okay.
Do you have another reason?
Well, I want to give a reasoning on why I didn't rate them that much higher. Was their international results, while there wasn't anything spectacular compared to
Yeah.
their domestic. They were kings of NA for such a long time, but they didn't really achieve anything outside of that.
Okay, so the funny thing is, actually, I didn't think that we'd have this one the same, but I actually have mine. That's my 5th one also, actually. I have them at 5th. And so, yeah, obviously, when we went down that criteria for both of us, the big problem they have is the international play, you know? Like, they were never really close to winning, like, big international competitions, you know? But they were just so insanely good domestically. I mean, those first 2 splits, obviously, like, they barely ever lost, you know? I think they lost something like... I think they lost like 7 games over the first 2 splits they played, which is insane when you consider they played like over 70 or something, you know. So that's absolutely insane. And also, this will sound weird, but like, okay, I don't have their like peak as high as some of the others in terms of like if you took like their best ever game they played, they didn't really dominate in the sense that some of the other teams on my list did, but their overall ability was insane. Like one of the things I used to love about them was actually the latter era when they weren't winning NA anymore, because that's when you saw like, okay, some of the strengths of the players went down, but the team's strength was always there, which is like ability to come back in the games, like make intelligent macro decisions. Yeah, in this sense, they were amazing, you know, because you could show that you could even take some of the strength away and they still could win games, which is obviously insane, right? And the longevity, like you said, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's also talk about the teams like when we discussed them, like their playstyle and stuff.
Okay.
I thought one thing that was really interesting from Cloud9 was they shifted focus on which lane they really give a lot of resource to.
Yeah.
And when you have the same players, it's really hard to do that because a team functions in a certain way and the players function in a certain way. So if you're used to being a carry player and you develop a skill for it, then you also don't really put a lot of time into being an independent, very resource-free player, and vice versa. Like if you're really used to being left alone, like you don't really develop skills for being a very good player when gold gets funneled into you.
Sure.
So in their earlier splits, they were very top and jungle focused. Meteos farmed a lot, and if he ever ganked, it was mostly top.
Yeah.
And Balls was their main carry. And as the season developed and as Sneaky got a lot better and jungle became less about farming, and as Balls became a little worse, they shifted a lot of their focus into getting Sneaky fed and having Sneaky be the main carry in team fights and mid and late game, and it worked out great for them. I think one of the core, I would put 3 players for the core reason why C9 was so successful, and they would be High, Meteos, and Sneaky. I think Balls and Lemon are good players, but I don't think they were anything special. But a player like Meteos, what he did early in his domestic splits where NA talent just got looked over and NA teams were saying stuff like, yeah, there's no talent in NA anymore, you have to import. Like what Meteos did to the scene was groundbreaking, and the amount of intelligence, the amount of shot calling, the amount of leadership High brought, I think puts High at probably the second or the best homegrown NA player ever, maybe competing with Double Lift. And Sneaky, along with Double Lift, has been a long-standing pillar of great NA ADCs, and he was someone that wasn't very good that became very good, and I think it's so rare to see that in NA. You're either good from the start, like you know how to be good, you have it, and you have the talent, or you just don't get better and you stay mediocre forever. And Sneaky was someone that started out as a mediocre player that turned out to be a true star, a true carry player. So yeah, I would credit a lot of C9's success onto those 3 players.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I like as well, like to touch on what you're saying here, is like it's not even just that the carry changed, but it's like usually there was a reason that guy wasn't the carry before. So, for example, in the case of Sneaky, I mean, obviously it was famous that they used to literally just play like Ashe Zyra, you know.
Ashe Zyra all day.
And the whole point of that,
box.
yeah, the whole point of that was not to smash lane, it was not to be the carry. I mean, it was just to play even. land arrows. In fact, what's funny is obviously Ash is back in the meta in a different rework, obviously, but it's a similar scenario.
So it's Zyra.
Yeah, it's not, the scenario now is not to carry lane either. In fact, you see a lot of the players who people call the cleanup AD carry, that's what they're playing now, So it's kind of a good timing for us to discuss this now, because now people will have a reference point that were around in Season 3. But then, yeah, in Season 4, I mean, obviously, High became more exposed because you had people like Bjergsen in NA, and he couldn't really compete with the international mids, So in this world, yeah, now you needed Sneaky to be more of a carry. And interestingly enough, at the same time that was shifting was actually also when Meteos had to shift, because obviously he used to be this amazing tank tile jungler where he just farmed up all game. Well, then he had to become a guy who was an early game jungler. In fact, I remember at the San Jose we referred to before, part of the reason they won it is that he all of a sudden he could play Jarvan, and he was landing all his combos on Froggen. He was a big reason why they won the tournament, So I think that's like a key element to add as well. It's like they did have that style that remained very similar, the macro style, but they even had to adapt within it, because that alone wouldn't have carried you the whole time, And I have to say, in terms of High, I always used to wonder when they had that lineup together how much of it is High, because in interviews they used to try and share the credit, no, Meteos makes objective calls, and then Lemon does the pick ban or whatever, but if you just saw the lineup when High went out and then when he came back in his different roles, and then some of the videos we've seen since, it's pretty obvious he was doing the majority of the shot calling. Maybe people gave him good info, but that guy's an insanely good shot caller for that team, at least. We can't really know what he'd be like for a totally different team.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to take credit away from the other players, but when you have a shot caller that good, you get spoiled and you actually don't learn the aspects of the game that you should, and you can play silently because High shot calls so much. I do think players like Sneaky, players like Lemon, players like Meteos would develop more of a shot calling voice, and they would have been fine without High if High left the team earlier and they had to adapt earlier. But when you played for 2 to 3 years with a certain shot caller and you don't have to make your own decisions later on in the game, you're just not going to be good at it.
One thing I will say, though, because obviously there's not much of a versus on this one because we both have them 5th, I will say as to kind of make a counterpoint against them in terms of why they're so low down the list and why actually, it could have been possible to put someone else, is when you look at the international results, I still think internationally they played macro pretty well, and they were able to compete with teams in that sense. So I have to say, compared to some of the other names on this list, I think their biggest flaw was they didn't really have good enough overall player level once you got to the world's level, Because I think though the other aspects were good. If you'd have had superstar players some of the other names, they probably could have won some of these titles.
One of the greatest NA memes is Warring Trend and Stuck in D2 for balls. So regardless of how true that meme was, regardless of how false that meme was, it was a meme for a reason, because Balls was stuck in D2 in Korea.
Sure.
And he did have a pentakill and he did have a great showing out Worlds, but there were definitely times where Balls was a hindrance for C9, I would say.
And you look at some of the others, I mean, okay, High was still a great shot caller internationally, but once you get to the international level, I mean, you can't compare High to some of the names that you're going to be running against at that level, if you go against someone like Pawn, he's just going to toy with High, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, if High competed at international events now, it would be pretty disgusting. People like Cram, people like Bjergsen, people like Faker.
Yeah, and also I think that's part of the reason why they sometimes had their issues with the EU teams, because obviously EU famously the mid laner was always the star, So yeah, I think that was the obvious problem there. Okay, who was 4th on your list then?
Okay, so the 4th on my list would be CLG Europe from Season 2.
Okay, yeah, they're on my list as well, so what's your reason?
So, CLG Europe, they didn't have the greatest of results domestically. They weren't a team that dominated. There were a lot of teams competitive with them at the time. There were SK Gaming, the Oslet era. There was Fnatic, the OG Fnatic with XPK, Soaz, Cyanide.
Yeah.
And also one of their greatest rival, Moscow 5. And there were so many other teams that were competitive with them where I can't say they dominated domestically. But where they do buy a lot of points for me is their international performance. They made finals at OGN, which was unheard of. It was just unheard of that a Western team or a Western players could compete in a Korean league and make the finals. In StarCraft, I was so used to StarCraft at the time, and just OGN, the tournament, where a team making it to finals was in a lot of ways groundbreaking and unheard of. And a lot of the NA teams and EU teams came over before CLG Europe did, and they just got smashed by the Koreans. They got smashed by mid-tier Korean teams.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a lot of great expectations for CLG Europe, but what they pulled off at that OGN I thought was amazing and like very good performance. And their other very notable finish would be semis, like the third and fourth at Worlds in season 2. They lost to Frost in a very, very infamous way. It was where not XPK, what's his name? Yellow Pete was playing Israel, and he had a Morgana shield around him, and he was defending a CZ turret. And Cloud Templar, the jungler for Frost, was playing Skarner. So Skarner back then was completely different how his ult worked. If he flashed and clicked you with ult, no matter what you did, barring you QSSing out of it, it was uncounterable. You could flash away, you could dash away, you could flash and dash away, but you would still get pulled. So you'd see images like a Skarner flash ulting someone and that person trying to react and that person like flash and arcane shifting away, and then they would pull back like a rubber band. So if a Skarner got to you, you were dead. And Cloud Templar, like, I thought this was one of the defining moments in his career. He was able to calculate how long the Morgana shield would last, and he flashed at the timing the shield was about to disappear, and Yellow Pete was playing up because he had the shield, and the moment he casted ult, the shield disappeared and the game was over when he got caught right there. So yeah, that was the two really good international results that CLG Europe was able to have. And the amount of time they were relevant as a team, I would say, would be about 2 years before Froggen decided to split the team into Alliance, and Crepo, Snoopay, and Yellow Pete went over to NA. I would consider that the end of their era. So they were domestically and internationally relevant for 2 years.
Yeah, I have them on my list as well, but I actually have them third. Here's the thing. I think they're the hardest team to rate on my whole list, because a lot of the other ones who are at the top are people who just were flat out very good internationally and had the domestic dominance. And the people at the bottom of the list are the people who mainly dominated domestically and maybe didn't have, it's like the other ends of the spectrum. And the problem, like you're saying here, is that they're kind of in the middle. Because the thing is, they obviously couldn't dominate domestically, right? Because Moscow 5 was around at the same time and did win everything. So
they went to Korea during a really important period.
So they only really won the one tournament, which was the DreamHack over Moscow 5. And the rest of the time, Moscow 5 got them. Moscow 5 got all those European tournaments. But they were still very good. They were consistently like a top European team. And then obviously, in terms of international results, they have some of the best ever. They didn't win any tournaments, but like you're saying, I mean, both times you could make a case they could have won each of these tournaments. I mean, the OGN one is obvious.
They definitely should have won. It was a reverse sweep.
Yeah, the OGN one I think is very fair, because that is the one where you add in, that's the one that has that ridiculous scenario where like Woong uses the fucking pulse fire Ezreal and steals like the red buff like blind. So like you can't really, he doesn't know the exact timing of where that is. It was blind.
They had a ward. They
did.
It wasn't
right,
blind.
Okay.
Yeah, it had a ward.
Still pretty fluky though,
Both times they lost, it was members of Frost having career-defining moments.
Yeah.
It's called the Woong steal. Whenever you steal red like that, it's called the Woong steal. The Skarner pull by Cloud Templar was fucking legendary.
Yeah.
The game 5, Mad Life playing All-Star versus Froggen's Diana was one of the best performances Mad Life has had in its career.
Yeah.
There was a team fight where Mad Life flat out denying Froggen. Like, when you play All-Star, he's exhausting Froggen whenever he enters the fight, and then he's All-Star Q pulverizing him, and then he's pushing him away with All-Star W. So he's denying Froggen from the fight for 10 to 12 seconds. Like, it was crazy. Everyone on Frost was having career-defining moments when they were playing versus CLG.EU.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about that final to me, though, is that obviously because Frost wins it, and Frost did have their own like legendary run of many finals and like some very good accomplishments. I actually think that they probably should have lost that final. Like in that final, Froggen was the best player in the series, and even in that game, he was making all these plays trying to win them the game, But like you're saying, they just had all the clutch plays basically.
There were like very unfortunate moments where in bottom lane where Crepo and Yellow Pete had a chance at a kill, and Crepo tried to give the kill over to Yellow Pete, and the dude lived. Yeah. Like whoever they were trying to live. And then like even in game 3 they were winning at a certain point. Like so many things went wrong for them. It would have been very the world we live. I guess the world we live in would stay mostly the same.
But it would have been a legendary
le-
moment if they'd have won
yeah.
OGN, considering no one else would ever even play again after that.
Yeah, I mean the League of Legends world would be different. How we viewed Europeans and how we viewed Koreans would be different if they won that tournament. Can you imagine if Frost lost that tournament? There's possibly Blaze goes to Worlds instead, and maybe Frost can qualify.
Yep.
And TPA still wins the tournament. Then we're living in a world where Korea doesn't win its own regional tournament, and they also don't. Maybe they don't even make finals at Worlds. For season 2 of Korea, people might have looked at it really differently. Like when people view and go back to season 2 nowadays, they think of it as TPA fluked the win.
Yeah.
They were the Omega underdogs, and the Koreans were the giants. Like when you look at the Zed Ignite video, like fucking the TPA dudes are like regular humans. They're tiny, and like Frost are like fucking giants. Like they're 5 giants, like about to pummel them to the ground. Like that's how it's viewed. That's what season 2 is looked at. But if like we would look at it differently if CLG.EU won the finals and TPA still won, then we wouldn't view season 2 as the dominance of Korea. We would view it as, oh, Koreans weren't that good, and the true Korean dominance started in season 3. But we talk about it now as season 2 was when Koreans started dominating.
Yeah. And for me, CLG.EU is a great example of a team where it's not as simple as saying, like, you have to win the tournament to be really, really good. Like, I always love that quote, right? It's actually a quote from Aristotle that says, like, excellence is not an act, it's a habit. It's the idea that it's like you have to be really good like day in and day out to show you're like a great player, you know. It's why obviously in team sports you can get players who never won the championship who are still like Hall of Famers and stuff, you know. If you really still play at an insanely high level for many years, such as a certain top laner from Blaze, then you would show that you were a great player even if you didn't win the ultimate title. So okay, I actually had them third on my list. So okay. I'll tell you the one I had fourth then. This might be a contentious one, Loco. You ready? Buckle up, mate. So, fourth on my list was the 2012 lineup of TSM, Team Solo Mid.
Because, the Reggie lineup.
The one that was Reginald, Chaos, Special, Dyrus, and Odd One. And the reason why is, first of all, domestically, they were dominant. Like, here's the thing. They weren't dominant like Cloud9 because it's true. People could win games off them. People could win series off them. But the thing is, they always won the tournament mostly that year. They won a lot. Obviously, it was Season 2 circuit, so it's not the same as having 2 LCS splits, you know. They had a lot of different tournaments to play in. I think they won something like 6 domestic titles, so that's pretty impressive. And then as I actually went over in an article I did recently about them where I kind of tried to redeem them a bit, I think people actually overplayed the storyline that like, oh, they sucked against the other regions. Because like, first of all, against Europe, it's only really Moscow 5 that they never got to beat because they never played them with the same lineup when they had Dyrus, right? It was only when they had Rainman that they'd played them
when they got pummeled in that IEM tournament.
Whereas when you look at the other teams they played from Europe, actually they won against some of them or they placed higher in the tournament against some of them when it was NA competitions, you know? And then against Asians, it's true, they had this insanely bad record against Koreans, but as I kind of show in the article, basically everyone lost to those Koreans in general, and they actually had a lot more close games against like Blaze and Frost than people give them credit for, you know. Just because you lost the game doesn't mean it wasn't a close game. And they actually, when I looked at those old games and went back, what they didn't understand was some of the macro concepts, like how to take towers, how to then push the lane. But they certainly, skill-wise, they were having team fights, mate, where they were absolutely in these games, you know. They were turning team fights against Blaze or Frost. So I always feel like they're a bit criminally underrated, you know. So I have them fourth on my list. Did they make your list, Loco?
No, I had an honorable mentions list, and they made it along with 2 other teams. We can talk about that.
Well, then would you have any arguments against them being on the list? Why would they not be on the list for you?
So for season 2, the 3 teams that I really focused on was them, CLG Europe, and Moscow 5.
Sure.
And because I had a recency variance for my metrics, I couldn't justify putting them on the list. They were the great NA team, but what CLG Europe and what Moscow 5 accomplished internationally versus what TSM accomplished internationally really put them far down on my list, and they weren't able to break top 5. Like, if you're going to be the greatest Western team of all time, or if you're going to make the top 5 greatest Western team of all time, you have to have Western results that we can at least argue about, where TSM had almost nothing. They had a couple of like domestic tournaments where European teams played, but like infamously, like they never won a game versus Koreans. So and that was the time and that was the period where teams were able to take games off of Koreans. CLG was taking games off of Koreans. European teams such as Moscow 5 and CLG Europe were taking games off of Koreans.
Okay.
Fucking TPA was taking games off of Koreans, but the fact that TSM was never able to take a single game off of Koreans really puts them further down on my list.
One thing I do think is unfair, though, that people didn't... I'll just throw this in as a last point on this one before we move on, is that if you actually look at what happened to them at Worlds, where they basically got the same treatment as Cloud9 did, like you just sit in the quarterfinals waiting to see who you'll play, and then you play a team that beats you, right? When they had to play Frost there, that is literally the most unlucky roll of the die you could get. Because first of all, there was that mad scenario where Frost had to play in the groups, even though they were number 1 seed.
Oh yeah, we should have played that scenario.
You know what I mean? So if they get any other team there who came out of the groups, the other teams from the groups was Najin Sword, IG, and CLG.EU. Now, sure.
Wait, we should explain the scenario. So there were 5 regions competing, and one region was going to have to play in groups, and the other 4 regions were going to be seeded.
Yeah.
So they literally had a lottery. They like put names in like a giant ball thing that like spun around and spit out names, and Frost's name didn't get spat out, so they had to play in groups. They literally got forced into groups because Riot planned the tournament with like having 5 major regions and 4 seeds. So they're like, okay, well, one team's just gonna get fucked, so let's have a random lottery. And the strongest region overall, Korea, got fucked. And that also fucked TSM because Korea got fucked and TSM was one of the teams that got seeded and they got matched up with Frost. It was fucking ridiculous formatting.
So I mean, like my point there is like, I mean, I'm not going to say they would necessarily beat all the other teams that were in the group, but they would have a much better chance, you know. Like, that's the team that no one wanted to face in the quarterfinals. Okay, who do you have as third on your list then?
Okay, third on my list is Fnatic from Season 2 to 4. So the original XPK lineup. It would be XPK, Cyanide, Soaz.
Okay.
And their bottom lane had a little bit of swap. They had Yellowstar, they had Freckles, and they had one more guy from SK. And N-rated, and they had a lot of swaps going on, but I would consider Season 2 to Season 4 Fnatic basically the same team.
Okay. Right, as a general criteria, I'll put this out there then. I only did like lineups of 5, you know, I never did any like roster moves in between them. Okay, so explain to me, what was putting this team so high up?
So their domestic results are crazy, actually. Did you know Fnatic won 6 splits, or 1, 2, they won before the whole G2 era, they won every split of LCS they played in, except for the one where Alliance took it. So their domestic results was awesome.
Well, I mean, 2 of those were when it was a different team. That was the Hoonie one, though. So, okay, say 3 out of 4 then, Loco.
Okay, 3 out of 4.
Yeah, that's still pretty insane. And they made the final of the one they lost, obviously.
And their international results were actually pretty good. So they didn't do that great at OGN.
Yeah.
But who did, other than CLG.EU? Their performance in IPL 4 was what really
IPL 5?
pushed them or IPL 5, yeah, my bad. IPL 5 was what really pushed them like high and beyond for me.
Yep.
Because that was like the Worlds after Worlds, and the formatting for that tournament was a lot better, and we got to see a lot of the top tier teams from all across the world play. Fucking Blades was there, the World Elite was there, CLG, TSM, like every good team was there, and that tournament was probably more competitive than Worlds, and their placement in that tournament really put them above for me.
Yeah.
And they also made round of 4 in Season 3 Worlds. They made semis. And in Season 4 Worlds, they didn't make it out of groups, but yeah, like the performances they had really, like their international results for including the recency bias outside of one team is one of the best in my opinion. So yeah, that's why Fnatic's number 3 for me. And they had a dynasty for such a long time.
Sure, yeah. Now, here's the thing. They're actually not on my list, but that's purely because, as I just said, I only did like 5-man lineups. So the problem is that actually they did a bunch of roster moves throughout that period. Like, for example, the IPL 5 team was wicked, but then obviously Reckless had to go out the team. They had to bring Yellow Stars, the AD carry. Then at the Worlds, they had Pushu. So, you know, just for my criteria, I couldn't include them in that way. Number 3 for me, we've already discussed, it was CLG.EU. You know, I had them in third. So let's go to number 2 for you. Who's number 2 for you?
Well, don't you want to talk a little bit more about the Fnatic lineup?
Yeah, if
What'd
you
you think
want.
of them? What'd you think of their dominance?
I would agree. Like, first of all, yeah, it's really impressive to win that much in LCS. And obviously, here's the thing that's interesting. It was something very new because since we'd never had the LCS format, back in the world where it was the open circuit, I actually
Yeah.
feel like that most suited Moscow 5, etc. Because then you know, famously Moscow 5 was a team that didn't like to practice a lot. And so what they would do was they would have a boot camp before a big tournament. And, you know, like they do in Counter-Strike, actually, you do like a week before the tournament, you know, you get everything sorted. Then the idea is you try and peak for that one tournament, you know. Whereas LCS, first of all, obviously did limit Moscow 5 because it meant they had to travel every week because they couldn't just stay in Europe because, as we found out, there's visa situations if you come from Russia. And then,
Ugh.
in contrary, Fnatic, interestingly enough, were the ones where they actually kind of perfected the peaking aspect, but for LCS. So what they would do is they'd kind of fuck around in the season, and then they would just do the same thing. They'd get it together in the last like week, you know, and then somehow in the playoffs, because they had some very clutch players, like obviously Expect is a very clutch player.
Yeah,
They,
XPK and Thoaz were so clutch.
Yeah,
They were the infamous party team. They were the
you know, true,
infamous
yeah.
Europeans, like go party, they drink all the time. But I mean, all the credits to XPK for like he's getting shat on right now and what's happening to OG and then
Yeah.
like him playing AD and like the organization going to shit. But what he accomplished while he was a player, like he would be known to like slack off, slack off, slack off. And then okay guys, it's time for finals, it's time for playoffs, it's time for worlds, and then XPK in playoffs, like XPK at worlds. Like that was a meme. Like XPK at worlds. Like this kid was solo killing Dade where he went from like fucking garbage tier to solo killing Dade, where he went from like XPK's fucking Dunzo to carrying this team in playoffs and in finals. Like what he did was fucking amazing.
And the funny thing is, because obviously, actually, the two names that unite all the rosters you're talking about is Expect and Soaz. Like, they actually, if you look at their style as players, this actually kind of carries over to how the team even played. Because those two players, not only did they kind of like fuck around in practice, but if you look at their personalities, they have like a very, it's called like a cavalier style. That's what we say in English, you know? And the idea is you play in a way that looks as though you don't care. Like, you're not really diligent, you know? But the idea is, the reason why you're like that is it's like an anime character, you know? You're really arrogant because you know you're very talented, you know? And so both of them actually had this quality where, again, they wouldn't practice, but then they could be amazing when they were on their game. And then also, they both actually shared the quality of sometimes they wouldn't play certain champions that were like meta, but then when it really mattered, they would just bring them out and everyone would be like, what, has he even been practicing that? And then they'd win games on them, you know? So I think if you look at Fnatic as a team, they shared that same quality because they had that style of play. I mean, famously, like for Fnatic brush style, you know, where you just hide and you're like a really weird pick comp style almost, where they would do that. And so in theory, okay, if you were a good enough team that you could beat that, you could beat Fnatic. But if you left any weakness because they were clutch, they could just win some crazy games even internationally, you know. So I think hey, to put it this way, in terms of excitement, probably one of the best teams on this list, you know, like a really sick team to watch. And yeah, they have the results as well. Obviously didn't win a Worlds or anything, you know. I mean, no one did in this era, but I think yeah, absolutely a fantastic team. But really weird in as much as it sounds weird to say that they weren't that dominant domestically because they won all the titles, but even the style of dominance was that same thing of like fucking around half the time when it doesn't matter, but then winning when it does.
When it matters.
So that's cool in its own way, you know. But
And they had their own flair, and they were definitely a cool team to root for. And they were like, I'd imagine for a lot of the Europeans, the one team they do want to root for. They're purely European. They bring you results domestically. They bring you results internationally. And they were just a very cool team. They had this kind of flair about them, and people loved XPK. People loved Soaz. People loved Rekos. Yeah, they were a very fun team to root for.
Like definitely one of the most stylish teams of all time. Like the team I always contrast them with is that OMG team from China, because again, the same thing, you know, like certain players are like very good but have their own flaws. But then when it's working, the idea is it's such an exciting style to watch, you know. You almost root for them just because you want to see a great game, you know. And even if they lose, it could be a great game. So okay, who is wait a minute, was that second?
Number three on my list.
That was number 3, right. Wait a second. Was that number 3 on your list?
Yeah, C9,
yeah.
CLG.EU,
Yeah.
and then Fnatic. That was my 5-4-3.
Okay, right. Well, my third was CLG.EU. What was your second one?
My second one is Moscow 5/Gambit Gaming.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, Loco. You can go into that in a second, but the problem with doing this system, I've realized, is now everyone knows what your number 1 is, and I'm pretty sure your number 1 is my number 2, and my number 2 is now your number 1. But let's just go with this first. Why is Moscow 5/Gambit Gaming number 2 on your list?
So while CLG didn't domestically dominate, Moscow dominated that era. They were the team to beat for Europe. Like, you know how we talk about Korean overlords? Before Korean overlords, they were the Russian overlords. Like, they
Yeah.
came out of nowhere. They were this team called Empire. They really cemented themselves as a team with this crazy play versus SK Gaming, where SK Gaming was also the big name European team at the time, was Nunu support waiting in a rush, like fully charging his ult, and three people walking in, and the Nunu support ult doing full damage, and then they just wiped everyone after that. And like people call that the Empire play.
Yep.
And even after that, like they revolutionized the game in a lot of ways, especially Diamond, their jungler. The way he played Shyvana, the way he played Udyr, the way he played jungle in general, like he really perfected counter jungling and being able to pressure the other team with winning lanes. Like what teams did back then was you won lane and then you farmed your jungle and then you met up for a big ass team fight. That's not what Moscow 5 did. Moscow 5 picked strong laners, and Diamond would be in your jungle all the time, counter jungling you, and their laners would be moving fast to help you or help the jungler and be able to bully out the enemy jungler, and they really perfected that jungle snowball style. And Alex Fish, another legendary player, his Rise performance, his Kha'Zix performance, and he was the original best mid at the time. I remember Bjergsen telling me a story, like whenever he first started playing, him and his friends were duo queuing, and then they went against Alex Fish, and then his friends was like, "Yo, dude, like this is the best mid laner of all fucking time. Like you better fucking perform." Like he was that kind of player, and they're very, very, very like something unique to them, and their X factor was they're the one team outside of Korea that had a very good winning record. I'm not sure if it was a winning record, but they probably had the best record versus Korean for any non-Korean team.
Yeah. Yeah, they did actually. I think at one point in time they had either like they were even or they had a slightly winning record before they'd got to like the end of their careers or whatever. So yeah, I actually had them as my number one. So I would say that okay. The interesting thing about this team is I think normally, right, when someone has a mystique around them, like an air of mystery, you don't know why they do things or how they do things, normally that makes them cooler, right? Because then when you get to know things, it's like a famous thing, okay? There's a famous Albert Einstein quote that says, like, if you want to be thought of as a genius, just don't reveal your sources. Like, just don't tell someone, like, where an idea came from or what you did or explain, like, the basics of what you did, because then it'll seem even more mysterious. But what's mad about them, the best way I'd describe them is, I actually did get to know a number of them on, like, a personal level and became friends with them. So I got to ask them all these, like, fan questions that you'd want to know, like, wow, did Darian really know what he was doing when he was just pushing up all the time? Like, what did Diamond Prox really? And here's the craziest part, Loco, is that actually the mystique has only grown since I got to know more, because they're the only team I can think of who are an all-time great team who didn't really know some of the things they were doing. Like, it's like some of the players almost just developed that style without consciously planning it out. They didn't have like a chalkboard where they went like, we're going to specially pick this comp to work in this way. They just played, and then somehow they had this mad, almost like animalistic way where it just fit together. So, for example, Darian didn't just think to himself, like if you were a coach analysing Moscow 5's games, you'd go, right, well, what Darian's doing here is he's taking pressure off his other lanes, and drawing the jungler top so that, like, the bot lane can push up and get a kill here. Like, he wasn't doing that, Loco. What he was doing was he actually is just some Russian guy who thought he was the best and just 24/7 pushed lane. And it just so happened his jungler always covered him top, Like, it was crazy shit like that they were doing,
They were a miracle team. I would say Alex Fish and Diamond Prox were top tier players. They were very, very good players, and they would have been top tier players on other teams. Not so much for Edward and Genja and Darian. And like they were all five like randomly Russian. Like 5 players that were randomly Russian that got together and their playstyle randomly clicked. They were like this beautiful disaster of a miracle.
Yeah. Because, for example, when we once had Edward on Summoning Insight, and again, right, think of it, Monty was around in season 2, so Monty's thinking that way, he's thinking like, it's just because we didn't have interviews with these guys because they're Russian, we just didn't get to hear like their reasons for doing stuff. And then I remember Edward told Monty that like Darian never timed any teleports. he would just be like they would be like, Darian, teleport now to the fight, quick. And then he would be like, teleport is down. And they'd be like, what the fuck? And then even better, so I said to Edward, who actually spoke pretty decent English, and I said, well, Edward, isn't it also true you told me that you used to never time summoner spells in bot lane? And he was like, well, yeah. And I was like, well, why the fuck though? And this is his logic, right? If you know this logic, you know why they were simultaneously good, but why they couldn't have been good forever when people started timing this sort of shit. Because Edward just said, well, if he has flash, then I will kill him. And if he burns flash, then he will come back 5 minutes later and I will just kill him then. Which is like, to have that confidence is great. Like, you know, not many people can have that. But in the era when you do have coaches, and Koreans are in team houses and they have started to figure stuff out, that's gonna drop off when you're not doing any of those extra things that like a coach could bring, you know, and thinking about the game strategically. So I think, unfortunately, like, here's what's great about them. Because they played for so long when Edward came back again, it's like the Cloud9 example. You got to see them when their strengths were taken away, like when Alexic wasn't the best mid anymore and Diamond wasn't. They could still win amazing team fights because they had sick team fighting. But that was like, by the end, that was all that was left. You know, they didn't have all these other crazy advantages, like no one knowing how to counter jungle. And so, again, you kind of see like the basic strengths and then the other strengths that add in at the beginning that make you the best. And also, you do have to say, unfortunately, there will always be kind of a what-if team, because they did just stay in Europe during season 2 and, you know, the majority of it. So they never went to OGN. So here's the thing. I mean, I can only speculate, but I actually think there probably are the Western team that could have beaten the Koreans. Like, you know, the first Blaze and the first Frost. I think they probably could have. Unfortunately, we'll never know because they never did. And in a weird way, because they never did, that also meant that those Koreans, it took them longer to be able to take the world #1 spot, you know, because everyone just had it as Moscow 5, right?
I mean, one thing that I want to say about Moscow 5, like, they were really magical and they came together at the right time and they had the right kind of talent and they meshed really well together. A team that I would really like to compare them to and ask you a similar question regarding it is Immortals. So Moscow 5, like, all their playstyles meshed perfectly together. Very high pressure players with a jungler that likes to counter jungle, and excellent team fighting. So they had a very cohesive playstyle from the start just because players meshed together really well. And I feel like Immortals had the same thing where they had very 5 cohesive players and how they wanted to play. Bottom was really independent. Jungler was very communicative. Huni and Rainover had their own thing going, and Pobelter was really independent. So they already had a playstyle that was set from the moment those 5 players started playing together till the very last game they played.
I think that, yeah, keep going.
In this era, that's not enough. You have to be able to adapt. You have to be able to fix stuff that's wrong. You have to be able to change and have multiple playstyles depending on the meta and depending on what's good. And that's the reality of things. And because things weren't as refined back then, because teams weren't as good, Moscow 5 didn't get punished and they could just make it on their natural talents and by chances, everyone having a very similar playstyle, and they didn't have to have a lot of conflict resolution because they were just winning all the time. But when they started losing, like, there were rumors about like Alex Fish and Diamond never wanting to play with each other again, and a lot of internal fighting, like Edward and Genja. So I think they were a highly dysfunctional team that just worked out because they were winning and they had players that were playing a style that was compatible with each other. If they played nowadays, like, they would face the same fate that Immortals did, but even faster.
Yeah, I like the model there, like the analogy, because I was going to say, until you said that last part there, like, the problem is that when Immortals' style was allowed to work, then they could be fantastic. I mean, we saw they were amazing in those regular splits, you know. But the point is, every time pretty much there was a meta shift in the playoffs and they couldn't adapt. Like, for example, obviously the most extreme one was obviously this last one where, like, you know, you couldn't do the lane swap anymore.
No. You don't think the Lucian? I think the Lucian top.
That was pretty bad.
Epitome of Immortals failure. Like,
that was
they
pretty bad.
Fucking crush regular seasons and they end their spring split on like fucking Lucian top. I thought that was the epitome of failure for Immortals.
Yeah.
Like,
no, I agree. But here's the thing. Okay, the difference is, like, to me, the spring one mainly fucked Huni, and the problem was he was like a key part. The difference is the summer one, the lane swap one, fucked Rainover, in my opinion. So that's the problem. Is, like, to me, he was like they'd figured out how to live without Huni smashing every lane, you know. But when they then got to the summer, and that just like cut Reignover's legs out from under him, you know.
It also fucked their bot too, because what happened was match lane started happening and their bot couldn't lane swap anymore, and their bottom would get pushed in, and the support would start roaming, and the mid would start roaming, and that's where Reignover started to get fucked. Reignover got fucked due to his laners. I don't think Reignover's playstyle got like figured out or anything, but due to his laners losing pressure and people being really, really cohesive, and jungle really isn't a 1v1 role anymore. Jungle's a very team versus team role, how well you can communicate, what you can do with your laner's resource. That's where Reignover started to get fucked. If Reignover had a bottom lane that could actually hold their own versus a lot of the other bottoms, then he would have been fine. Like, he wouldn't get fucking invaded upon all the time, and he would be able to like at least try to carry the game.
But yeah, to bring it back to the Moscow 5 example, I kind of agree in that sense. Like, here's the difference. Yeah, when their style was working, yeah, they were the best. The difference is in some of the later seasons and later years, it's like their style wasn't the best, and I'm pretty sure they didn't know strategically, you know, what every other team was doing. But the difference was, you know, going through to season 3, early season 4, you could still just team fight and win games, and that's the point. They always had fantastic team fighting. Like, in a weird way, I think actually one of the things I always admired about the Korean teams is like they understood the hierarchy of which target to go for and in which order in a team fight. And I don't think Moscow 5 knew it. Like, if you pause the replay, I don't think they could tell you like what they were doing. It's just that the skills of the 5 players meant they almost automatically had the similar type of role, you know. Like, for example, like, since Darien and Gosu Pepper are so balls deep, they're just going super harm in, so they're like drawing attention away from their carries, and then fucking Alex Ich would always like wait and bide his time to like get all the killing blows on everyone with some carry champion, Kazakhs, whatever. So it's like they actually had, and also remember famously, Genja actually always was one of those like clean up AD carries. You know, he was never the guy who's going to have any peel. He was not doubleth, you know. He's going to just sit on the outside and auto attack whoever isn't shooting him, basically. So in a weird way, yeah, again, that's even magical how they team fought. It's almost like it was designed, but it wasn't. And I guess in a way that's not as crazy as it sounds, because I guess if they'd been even slightly not as good, we wouldn't be talking about them right now. So we would have never seen them, and they never would have won those games because they weren't super strategical. But yeah,
there were probably 100 teams like Moscow 5 where
but didn't just have the quite mix. Yeah, I agree. That's why to me they're the ultimate miracle team, mate. I've never seen a team that had.
You can't model a team after Moscow 5.
No. That's why I think they themselves dropped off, because they themselves didn't necessarily know exactly what they were doing and how to shift it, you know. So when it just stopped working, they had to break up. I will say one thing, though. The one thing that makes them really weird is, like, I also think they're the ultimate what-if team on this list because of what I said about LCS. Where for LCS, they literally never had a house in Germany. They never could just live in Germany the whole split. Like every other LCS team lives in their region. Every week, they would literally travel on flights. So, like, and by the way, because they were living in like Eastern Europe, they had to take more than one flight, you know. So it was like half a day travel every time, if not a day travel. And they would have to do this every single week of LCS. So sure, they never won an EU LCS split. But if you were in a world where they could have somehow gotten visas and just stayed in Europe, it's possible they could have done better. Now, I can't say if they would have done better and beaten Fnatic. You know, we can't know. But I think there's at least you have to open the door for it, right? They could have actually been maybe even a better team.
I mean, I sort of like where their story ended, because if, say they could do those things, say they could get a house.
Yeah.
I don't think their players had the maturity or the willingness to actually work together as a team and learn and fix their problems. Things were fine when they were winning because they were winning. It's hard to have problems when you're winning.
Yeah.
But if they came to the reality of the situation and they were just spoon-fed success, they didn't put a lot of work into it. They played a lot of games, but there were so many pros that played a lot of games and they still didn't win because they weren't smart. They weren't willing to put in work, as in like teamwork, dedicated practice that's actually like directed towards something. Problem solving internally, I don't think Moscow 5 would have been willing to do any of that. So when talent no longer carries you anymore and they have to start working on that kind of stuff, I don't think they would have been willing to do it. And by having this out of being like, okay, when LCS started, like they could never like live in Germany together as a team, and that's why they didn't do well, I think is probably the best ending for them than them actually having a shot at it and starting to fail slowly and people and their mystique going away. So I kind of like the ending they had.
Okay. I will acknowledge, by the way, here's the thing, like I still think, you know, maybe they could have won one split or something, but I do agree with you on the point that in a way that would have seemed like a better thing for them results wise, but it could also definitely have been a worse thing personality wise. Like the thing you're saying about the rumors were true. Like actually they had players in their team. This is why it's also so crazy that they played together so well, because they actually had players who did not like each other. Like players who thought the other person was like selfish or wouldn't play the right style. And famously, one of the things towards the end that made Alexic want to leave is that a couple of the players, Darian and Genja, eventually got so that they didn't even play solo queue. Like they used to be in like Masters and stuff when Challenger existed, and they didn't give a fuck. I mean, you've seen now when Genja still plays, you know, they used to, even if they did play, they would just like, it's not that they were trolling because they weren't trying to be bad, they were just fucking around, you know. And then the idea is, if you're losing games and then you're, you know, like your team's in theory good enough to do well in LCS and you don't, like for example, that was the one where famously they went out in the first round and then Alexic just left after the relegations. That was where, if you're Alexic, you're like, guys, we could maybe win LCS, and then they're just not even practicing at all. I mean, that's going to tilt you, you know, like, that's not going to last forever. So I agree. If you'd been in a house and you literally saw that guy not even playing solo queue and doing, I don't know, whatever they did in their free time, that probably would make you like self-destruct even quicker as a team, probably. So, okay, if you had Moscow 5 as your second best team, then I'll have to tell you my second best team, and you can probably guess who it is.
TSM 2014.
Definitely not. So, obviously, the second team on my list, I'm pretty sure they're number one on your list in this scenario, is going to be...
No, TSM 2014 is my number one.
It's going to be... It better not be. But it's going to be Fnatic 2015. The team with Huni and Ren. I'm assuming that's your number one, right?
Yeah, that's my number one.
Okay. So, okay, I'll just say before we go into that, because obviously we're going to have to just discuss it as the number one anyway.
Yeah.
I'll just say the reason I had them below Moscow 5 and Gambit is because I do think they fulfill nearly all the criteria on this list. You know, like, yeah, they have the amazing domestic dominance. They have really good international results as well. The problem is, when I said, like, results, I also count results, like, relative to your era. And so even though it's quite tenuous, you can say that at one point in time, Moscow 5 was the best team in the world. And there was also a period where they did beat the West Korean teams. Whereas that's the one thing you can say about Fnatic is, like, semis at Worlds is still great, but, I mean, I saw them go against Ku Tigers, and that wasn't pretty, you know. So that's the one area where I can put Moscow 5 above them personally. So, what's your reasoning for Fnatic 2015? Hit me.
Well, Fnatic 2015, their first split ever, they went 13-5, 3-2 versus H2K, and 3-2 versus Unicorns. They barely won the split. But it's still a really great split for a team that disbanded and had to find new players and form a new team.
And some of them were rookies, obviously.
Yeah, a lot of them were rookies, actually. And their 18-0 summer split, I mean, oh, you said you only did 5-man squads, but this one has to be your exception then, because they had Steelback and they switched to Reckles.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, fuck that. Well, in that case, maybe I'll just count the summer and the Worlds one for me then. It would still be second, I think. That's still pretty good. 18-0 and top 4. Okay, so for you, you're counting both splits, right? Yeah, and MSI, presumably, right?
Mm-hmm. So their 18-0 summer split, their first and only perfect split by any other LCS team. TSM got pretty close.
Yep.
3-0 versus Unicorn in semis, and 3-2 versus Origin in finals. So, amazing domestic results. Probably, I would say, 9 out of 10. And their international results, they actually didn't do that great at MSI groups. They nearly crashed and burned. They went 2-3.
Yeah.
They beat TSM and the wildcard team. And then they lost to EDG, SKT, and HQ. And in the knockout stage, they lost versus SKT in a very close series, 2-3. Probably one of the best performances versus SKT in a long time. And even though, like, losing to SKT, usually, like, you don't feel that bad. You're like, okay, we lost to SKT. No one else was going to beat them. But the exception for this MSI was someone else was going to beat them. EDG beat SKT. Yeah. In that MSI, so their win or their close loss versus SKT doesn't give them as much credit as it usually would when you lose to SKT 2-3.
As in, if SKT had just won the final, then it'd feel like you were closer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And at Worlds, they were 4-2 in groups, and they got out first. They actually definitely could have like gotten knocked out at groups. They were 1-2 in the first week. They won versus IG, but lost to C9 and HQ. But after their like short break, they adapted really well. Reignover started playing a lot better. They brought out the AD Cannon, and they swept the last week 3-0. even though they swept, some of the games were close, and C9 and HQ and IG just threw the games at them. So they clutched out of the groups to make it into round of 8. And in round of 8, they dumpstered EDG. So while 3-0ing EDG is freaking impressive, EDG is historically one of the greatest teams. This was a really bad season for all the Chinese teams. EDG, LDG, IG were actually pretty bad at Worlds. And EDG was also having a lot of problems with their top, and they weren't the same team that was dominating MSI.
Yeah.
So they're 3-0 in round of 8 in a very top-dominant meta. For Huni and Reignover were really great. And for EDG, who was struggling and switching out their top with Amazing Zay and Koro 1, it wasn't that fair of a matchup. And I wouldn't say their 3-0 over EDG was as impressive as people might make it out to be. And then at round of 4, they just got dumpstered by Rocks. The Smep demolished Huni. Yeah. Their bottom lane got outclassed. The first game was close, but after that, it turned into a library. It was held at a European venue, and all the European fans were dead inside. So their international results, sure, round of 4 at Worlds is great. Sure, closely losing out to SKT is great. But when you dissect it, they weren't that great of a team internationally. They struggled a lot, and they barely made it through.
Sure.
So, I mean, they are still the number 1 on my list due to their relevancy bias, because a team like this hasn't existed in the West for a long time.
Yeah.
Another team like this would be TSM this year, TSM 2016, but their international showing they didn't have an international showing. While this Fnatic had somewhat of an international showing versus the best in the world.
Okay, so for this one, I mean, since I have them high up as well, I'm not going to argue against them, but I'll give a reason as to why I think... okay, this will sound weird. I'll give a reason as to why I actually think that, in a way, they might be greater than they even look on paper. So, for example, in the undefeated season, obviously the one storyline that didn't work is they didn't go undefeated in the final, right? It was still 3-2, and Origin was definitely in the games. But if you remember, that was where, I think it was around the playoffs, was when Gangplank suddenly became super OP if you could play it, right? And
that patch was fucking crazy. I remember... because I was coaching at the time for TSM, Quas was playing a lot of Gangplank, and we were like, holy shit, is Gangplank good? So Dyrus started playing Gangplank, and then after 10 games, Dyrus told me, yeah, Gangplank's not good. We don't have to worry about it. It's a troll pick that Quas does. Because Quas was known to do troll picks. He would practice Swain. He would practice some random ass champion like Aatrox. So we were like, okay, this is Quas practicing some random ass champion. And suddenly Gangplank was seeing results in solo queue and in other regions. We were going crazy, holy shit, maybe Gangplank is good. And it did turn out Gangplank was crazy good.
So the problem with that is, if you remember, SOAS was one of the first people in the West to have a really good Gangplank. So I actually think that if their patch hadn't have sort of gifted him that weird pick, I don't think it would have been as close. I think they could have actually just beaten Origin, even though they were both very good teams. So I think in a way, that's not as bad as it looks to go 3-2 there. It's not like they suddenly weren't as good as they were in the split. They were still a sick team. And then for the Worlds one, I do agree with you. Some of the results when you pick them apart are a bit ropey. But even so... And even though I agree on the EDG one, EDG wasn't as sick as they might have been, if they hadn't have had that whole thing with fucking Koro 1, if he'd have just stayed in the team and not left ever, maybe they would be a better team. But even so, it's very rare in history that Western teams even beat Chinese teams in best of fives, So it still is pretty legit to beat the core of a very good team in a 3-0 in a best of 5,
My problem with it is the EDG name carries a lot of value and carries a lot of significance, and the EDG team that showed up for round of 8 does not live up to the name. So saying something like you 3-0'd EDG would be holy shit, that's fucking impressive, dude.
Yeah.
Props to you. I can't give the same kind of props to this Fnatic lineup.
Sure. And yeah, unfortunately, I mean, to me, the coup series was actually perfect. Here's the thing. I think that is a really fitting way for that lineup to end, because the lineup was amazing, and they had periods that they were very good, and they had the SKT era where they went 3-2 with them, and they won domestically. But since so much of it was predicated on the fact that they had that amazing top laner and the top jungle synergy, it's kind of fitting that you took that top laner who played that quite a brute force style and then put him against Smeb, who was one of the few people who actually could just make that not work at all, and then that's kind of how they lost. Like it kind of showed the limitations of what they were capable of. Like they weren't going to win worlds, put it that way. That's like kind of the point of what that showed me. And I think the same would have happened if they'd have gone against SKT. They would have also lost in similar fashion.
Oh yeah, Marin and Marin and Smeb and Someday were all crazy good players, and Huni was also a crazy good player, but he didn't have to play versus other crazy good player. While these three played versus crazy good players all the time, so. Yeah, it was quite a fitting end where the Sword lost to a stronger Sword.
No, exactly. That's the point, right? Because he essentially didn't. Here's the thing. This will sound like a fucked up analogy, but he's almost like one of those players who's like, let's say he's like a high masters player, okay, and same position, top lane, and in all his matches until he gets to high masters, he's just dumpstering everyone in lane, and every time he has the power spike, he goes all in. Every time he has like a slight trade advantage, he kills the enemy, and so he's used to like being an old school top lane. He thinks you just snowball top lane all the time. Problem is, when he then gets to high masters and he's playing those games versus some low diamonds, he's going to quickly find out that like, if you get behind a few kills in the game, if you keep trying to like play that style, you're just going to snowball the game the other way. You're going to wreck yourself 10 times harder. And it almost felt like, because he'd never gone against Smeb, Someday, Marin, he didn't know how to deal with that, Whereas in Europe, if you think of the best tops at the time, like, okay, you had Kabashard, who was kind of like a carry top laner, but Gambit wasn't a sick team at the same way. And then the other one was actually Odo Amne, and he was more like a low econ style. So there wasn't really anyone to show Huni that didn't work until, unfortunately, this, like, the biggest stage in the world, and, like, who was probably the best top laner just smashing his head in. So it sucks for him, I've no doubt, but it was kind of a fitting end. That was, like, as far as Fnatic was going to go,
So, yeah, I mean, I do think they were such a great team, and I would have liked to have seen them stay for longer. I think it would have done wonders for Huni and Febiven if they still stayed under Daylor and they kept the same roster, and maybe they switched out Yellowstar with like Mitty. Like that would have been, or maybe they switched out both their bottom duo with Mitty and Zben instead of Mitty and Zben going to G2. We could have had another run like that this Worlds, and we could have had a truly great Western team, and Fnatic could have continued their dynasty, and it would have been such a great story for Fnatic in Europe. Like the passing of the torch from Yellowstar to Mitty, I mean, it's already happening. Like it did happen in terms of like Yellowstar. I think Yellowstar sitting out for All Stars and him going into PSG and Mitty going to All Stars instead. The greatest support in Europe is now no longer Yellowstar, it's Mitty. And Zben taking over for Reckles, while I really appreciate the amount of work Reckles puts in and how good he is, but Zben has that clutchness. Zben has that aggressive playstyle. Zben doesn't fall over in lane, and Zben with Mitty would have been such a great bottom duo to see play with rest of that original Fnatic lineup with Reign over Huni and Febiven, and maybe Huni and Febiven under Daylor would have matured faster, would have been more disciplined, and not had these terribly bad splits on Immortals or the new Fnatic. And yeah, like it was really sad to see them go and their journey that way.
Okay, I've got a question for you. So if we did this lineup after this list rather after Season 5 Worlds, and you knew that Fnatic splits up, I'm sure most people would probably say, oh, we'll probably never get another team who could be on this list. But as you kind of referenced, like TSM Summer Split this year looked like they could. They looked like, if they did a really deep run, they'd be on this list. So do you still think beyond even that team, it's possible, like there can be a Western team that could be like top 3 on this list, that could rise up there and could have a Fnatic-esque run?
Definitely. If you remember our last episode,
sure,
in Thorin versus Loco Doco episode 1, Loco Doco handedly proved Thorin wrong that the gap is closing, and there is going to be better. There is going to be better Western teams popping up. So I do think we are going to see teams maybe a year or 2 years from now. If you did this list again, the top 5 list would be different.
Okay. Is there either a team on this list or a team that didn't get on the list that you want to pick out that like you think actually could have done this? They could have had some insane international result, or they could have done whatever it took to be PDM number 1, but something went wrong, or some player didn't live up to his potential. Is the one you could pick out?
So one of my honorable mentions was OG from Season 5.
Yep. So
the amazing. So as Expeke Mitty and Zeben.
Yep.
I think that team had a potential to be really great, but they were limited by how much work that XPK was willing to put in and how much work Soaz was willing to put in this kind of era.
Yeah.
So they were an honorable mentions team, and just Zeben and Mitty are so fucking good. I can't wait to see what they do with G2 next. So yeah, I mean, they are an honorable mentions team. Maybe G2 in the future, if they get a different top laner or expect growth a lot more, they could be this kind of team.
Yeah, the problem I see with the OG team is, like, I kind of agree in as much as, like, they actually were also kind of like the old Fnatic teams, because they obviously was expecting. So as in as much as, again, they were clutch, you know, like they could perform maybe better than you'd expect under pressure. The problem is, like, by the time you get to season 5, like the amount that you can do by being clutch is not going to be as great as it used to. You have to also be a very good player. So, for example, at Worlds, I think you saw both those players get exposed a bit. Like Soaz was like all right, but he wasn't that great, you know. And for example, like actually having Gangplank at that point didn't matter as much. Now you have to have Fiora at that Worlds, and he didn't, you know. And then Expeke, that's probably the weirdest international competition I ever saw him play, because every other one, even Season 4 Worlds, you know, he could get those like crazy plays off where he solo kills Dade. But by Season 5 Worlds, he was just like a mage player, you know. Well, it didn't even look like Expeke, you know. He would just play like a Nivea, which is like, this isn't the Expeke I know, you know. Like, so unfortunately, that's what I feel like held them back, is bizarrely the big names, because the rest of the team, I mean, that bot lane was already awesome back then.
Yeah, I mean, and also depending on what happens with TSM, this is after IEM Oakland, by the way, where TSM lost to Unicorns of Love 1-2. It seems likely that they won't stay with Turtle. Maybe they go with a big international name for AD, and Biofrost and Hanser really grows. I think Sven and Bjergsen are already world-class players. Sven improved so much in the last year. The player he is now is definitely different from the player he started out when he joined TSM. I mean, he's half the size. He's way better strategically, and I just hear good things about him from TSM players and the TSM organization, and the kind of performance he puts up is amazing. So I think TSM has 2 core building blocks in Bjergsen and Sven, and world-class players. Haunter could definitely be one of those players, and so could Biofrost. I'm not too sure about Turtle, and they have an import slot available, so they could get a different import for AD. Or maybe they keep Turtle or get an NAAD, and they're like, maybe we really want to win this year, and they get an international name for top. I don't know. But I think TSM has enough world-class building blocks where they could definitely break this list in a year or 2.
So I have a name for the list that I don't know how you're going to feel about this. I've never asked you about it, so maybe it'll be controversial. But I actually think that Season 4 Alliance team could have done much better, because obviously it was... Here's the thing that people forget. This isn't to make excuses, by the way. They did lose to Kaboom. They lost like idiots. That pick ban was an abortion. And yeah, they didn't get out of the group. But here's the crazy thing. There's so many different ways that could have all played out that I think would be different. Like, first of all, if they hadn't lost to Kaboom, which is not a ridiculous thing to say, you know, obviously they were favourite to win that game. Kaboom wasn't a very good team. If they don't, then it would have been actually a 3-way tie at the top of the group. And actually, they'd done pretty well against the other 2 teams. So I think they have a good chance to get out of the group. Secondly, if actually Cloud9 just didn't beat Najim White Shield, then they also would have gotten out. So actually, both of those scenarios could have gotten them out, or could have gotten them with tiebreakers. And the key thing is, the reason why I give them a chance to be better is because in that group, since White Shield turned out to be a bit weaker than we'd expected, winning the group was possible. And if you won the group, you got to go straight and play OMG in the quarterfinals, whereas in the end, Shield won the tiebreaker and they got that side of the bracket. So you also would be on the easier side of the bracket. So I can't say that they would have gone deep. I won't do like an amazing and go like, I want this game and then they win this season. I won't go that far, but I will say I would have loved to have seen them versus OMG in the quarterfinals, because the thing is, they did have some good pieces in their team. Like at the time, Froggen was still very solid, you know. Shook was like an aggressive jungler that not many people from the other regions necessarily knew about. Yeah.
That team had a very, very short lifespan.
Sure.
Shook's mindset and Wicked's mindset and the skill limit on Nif. Froggen was the only world-class player they had. Like that team, due to their mindset and what the players were like and certain limitations, I don't think would have ever been an internationally great team or a dynasty. Sure, they could have gone further at that Worlds, but that would have been it for them.
Sure, but they did wreck that summer season of EOCS, so that with a good Worlds placement would have been interesting.
That's very short, but like on the same like argument, OG is kind of like that, but OG could have gone farther. because their core building blocks in Zban, Mitty, and Amazing are a lot better than Alliance's core building block in just Froggen, really.
Yep. No, I think it's just a suggestion. So, okay, right. To end this episode, let's have one last topic, okay? So the last topic I want to ask is, when you were trying to figure out like the NA teams for this list, you haven't got many on there for you.
Yeah.
So is there a reason why it's nearly all EU teams on the list, Loco?
Instead of NA?
Yeah.
So NA usually gets the better imports, and EU usually has the better homegrown players.
Okay.
But say a lot of the EU teams were from Season 2, and in Season 2, EU just was better than NA. So that's why. And I think recently NA has been a lot stronger than EU in a lot of ways. So that's why, because in Season 2 there were 2 EU teams that were extremely good in Moscow 5 and CLG.EU. That's why they took 2/5 of the list up. And the Fnatic roster was, like, it was also really lucky that they landed up with Reignover and Huni. Like, no one gave Fnatic credit when they first came together. They were like, who the fuck is Reignover and Huni? Oh, Reignover, the kid that got fucking shat on LGIM. Oh, Huni, a fucking nobody. Who the fuck? What is a Huni? Who the fuck is a Huni? And then, oh, Featherben, a challenger player. Wow, great. Steelback. Tire already. That was the story behind Fnatic, and it all magically came together under Daylor. So, cause they had Daylor and cause they had Fnatic or Huni and Reignover, like that made that Fnatic team great. There's a lot of great European mids.
Yeah. Actually, I want to make one last point there, actually. That's something that I also should have mentioned in terms of how I also think Fnatic could be better. I agree with you. They should have just kept that team together, because actually, when you think of it that way, that a bunch of them were like LCS level rookies in the first year that they did all of this. I mean, remember, famously, obviously they got Reckless later, but like Steelback, it wasn't until Season 6 that people started to actually look at him as like a good player, because he actually improved a lot, you know. He was kind of quite shaky when they first got him. Featherben, obviously, famously, actually hadn't been in LCS just because he choked in a lot of the qualifiers. Huni, like you're saying, was a nobody. He hadn't played at all, basically. And then Reignover had played, but was considered like a reject in Korea, you know, and probably wouldn't have gotten a shot if he didn't go to the West. So when you consider all of that, and then the massive growth they made over the whole year, I'd love to... Here's the thing. Maybe they won't stay together for 3 years, but I'd love to at least see one more split. At least see what would happen in Season 6 with them, right?
I think Fnatic as an org is good enough where if they kept them for one more split or one more year, and they did well with it, they would have done anything in their power to keep the roster together. Like, imagine 2 years of Fnatic dominating like that in this kind of era. The amount of fan base they would be able to capture across Europe, that's something that Fnatic does really well that a lot of European teams struggle with. A lot of European teams are very regional. Like, you have NIP and their NIP following, like Swedish, right?
Yeah.
And then what are the other famous, like, the European teams have a very like regional following, like that are very country based, but Fnatic is all across Europe. Everyone across Europe loves Fnatic, and having 2 years of that Fnatic roster would have really captured the European League of Legends audience under one brand, and that would have made Fnatic as a brand super fucking strong. And in my opinion, they should have done anything possible. Sell parts of the company if you need to, get an investment, but make sure you keep Huni and Reignover and have another split at it. Oh, could you, like, the what is it, history, or like the alternate history that I presented where they keep Huni, Reignover and Featherben and they replace their bottom with Zben and Mitty, like that would have set Fnatic up to dominate European League of Legends until like League of Legends dies, in my opinion.
So next
that
year
would have
then?
been.
Okay, right. We end on that note then, yeah, okay. So, no, yeah, I think they would have certainly had a chance, especially because how young a lot of the players were, obviously. Yeah, that's a key detail. Okay, we'll just end on that note. I'll end it there.
Okay.